Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Dr. Gagandeep Kang returns to the BIC Talks today to talk about drug discovery and development on COVID-19. She's an award-winning medical scientist and the executive director of the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute. Dr. Kang was here earlier on episode 8, The Quest for Immunity, to talk about vaccine development on COVID-19 and human immunity against the disease. Dr. Kang, welcome back to BIC Talks.
Thank you for having me here, Pavan.
It's our pleasure entirely. I wanted to dive in and start by asking, we have so few antiviral drugs today and perhaps even fewer antiretrovirals. We saw this antibiotic revolution, if you will, post the Second World War, where we started getting a lot of new antibiotics that work extremely well against bacteria. We're having challenges with that today, but have we had a similar moment with antivirals, or is there something that is inherently more challenging about creating drugs that target viruses?
So if you look at how viruses replicate, they have to get inside cells to multiply, whereas bacteria, you can attack outside of cells. So when you're looking at drug development, you need to find a target that is so specific to the virus that it affects only a function of the virus and virus replication and not the function of the cell which the virus has infected. Now, this is a complication in terms of drug development and was the major reason why there was such a challenge in trying to develop antivirals, unlike antibiotics or antifungal agents, which we've had for a really long time. The great revolution in antiviral development actually started with HIV. There had never been such a concerted effort to make antiviral drugs until HIV came along. And much of what we have learned in terms of the structure and function of viruses and how they replicate came from those early lessons from HIV, and subsequently we've had new antivirals, including for hepatitis viruses, and more recently some of the drugs that we've seen for influenza and trying to target Ebola, MERS, and coronaviruses. So the revolution is really only about 30 years old, but we have come a long way in understanding how to design antivirals.
So we need something that can target the virus but keep that host cell intact and not kill the human cell itself. So here, could you give us a sense of how this worked with HIV? Because there are so many drugs and people who have to live with HIV take a cocktail of these drugs as well to prevent the antiviral resistance built in. Could you give us a sense of what these drugs target?
So in terms of HIV, the first drug that we had was AZT, and that was a game changer in terms of finding something that actually worked. But if you look at what happens with HIV is that the virus develops resistance very quickly because it changes very rapidly. And that's why we use now a cocktail of drugs. And that cocktail addresses different stages of HIV replication. So you will have nucleoside analogs, you will have protease inhibitors, different classes of drugs that approach different steps in HIV replication. And the idea here is the same one that you have for tuberculosis, for example, which is if you give different classes of drugs, then you will be able to prevent the development of resistance.
Thanks, Dr. Kang. This sort of brings me to this idea within drug development, which has, I think, been the paradigm with which all of us have been working, which is the idea of rational drug design, right? Where serendipity still played a huge role in early drug discovery and perhaps still plays it today. But the idea is that now we can design drugs with a target in mind, right? So if with HIV, there is this reverse transcriptase that makes the HIV RNA, helps it to become DNA, and then it gets used in the cellular processes. So now that becomes a unique target that a drug can go find and bind to or block in some way. So could you tell us about this rational drug design process a little and the extent to which it applies in real drug discovery conditions?
Okay, so we have tools now that we have never had before. So if you look at what you want to do, as we discussed, it is something where you want to get to the virus and the proteins of the virus, the enzymes of the virus, rather than enzymes that are active for cellular processes and might result in damage to the host. So reverse transcriptase in HIV is a multifunctional protein, and it has been a primary target for drug discovery. And the classes of reverse transcriptase inhibitors that are used are nucleoside RT inhibitors and non-nucleoside RT inhibitors. And with these two drugs, we've been able to achieve a fair amount of control, but there has been a feeling that we need to move beyond them, and computational methods have come into play. So what do computational methods do in this space? They look at what the HIV reverse transcriptase does, and then they break it down into different steps. So what they're trying to do is look at how is the interaction between the RT and its target? So what is molecular docking look like? What is the dynamics of that docking? What is the free energy that goes into that docking mechanism? How do you do a structure activity relationship? How do you look at potential absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion of this class of drugs? So you go through what is a standard way of developing drugs, seeing how they work. But before you get to an actual experimental system, you can use computational tools to predict how these drugs are likely to behave in those experimental systems and then validate it by testing in the real world.
And is the benefit of this that the process of discovery becomes perhaps less expensive and we are able to examine many drug candidates? Because the conventional wisdom is that you start with 1,000 candidates, you probably narrow it down to 10, and then one might reach the market, right? Or the numbers might be even crazier than that.
Nowadays, what is done, so the old way of doing discovery was first to understand the entire disease process, then think about what might be the steps at which you could interrupt the actions of the pathogen, look for compounds that you knew or were in related diseases, and then bring them to bear here. More recently, we've switched to higher throughput experimental systems, and this is really through having the ability to screen thousands of compounds for specific activities. And from those thousands of compounds, you can come down to hundreds of compounds, and here you start looking for not just the activity, but you start looking for selectivity, you start doing efficacy assays, and you start doing what I described earlier, which is called ADME or ADMET calculations, which stands for absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and toxicity, which are all required because you don't want a drug that is not going to be absorbed, a drug that is not going to be available at the site of action, and you don't want a drug that is toxic. So this process takes you from what is called a hit to a lead. And once you have a lead, you will go through those many leads to do lead optimization and come down to a smaller number of compounds, which can then be taken through preclinical studies. And in these preclinical studies, what you will be doing is pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. You'll decide what kind of compound you're looking for. For example, if you have the compound as multiple salts, which one would you choose? Once you have proof of principle, you take it into preclinical development, and here you will be doing toxicology studies, safety pharmacology in one or more species of animals. Once you've been through all of that is when the drug comes into humans. Now, if you think about the tools that we have currently, these processes can all be aided by computational tools. But more recently, what people have been looking at is other ways that we could apply artificial intelligence to try and make this process even more efficient and faster. And there has been screening of literally millions of compounds, and we are getting to a stage where this is actually turning into something that is really quite useful and allows us to iterate much faster than we could previously.
So, how have you seen the literature and the work on drug discovery happen for COVID-19, given that we have all these new tools at our disposal?
COVID-19 obviously has been looked at in a way that no other disease has been looked at with in terms of speed. In terms of scale, HIV was probably similar, but over a much longer period of time. So if you look at what people have tried or are trying for COVID-19, there are obviously antiviral drugs, but people have also been looking at whether immunomodulators and other investigational therapies might also help. Now, one thing is important to understand is that when you have viral replication at the highest level, that replication is early in disease. So if you're looking at giving an antiviral agent, you should be giving the antiviral at an early stage in illness, perhaps before a person winds up in a hospital. By the time people get to a hospital, the activity of an antiviral is going to be less effective because now much of the disease pathology is because of the host response. And at that stage, we should be thinking about whether antivirals should be combined with immunomodulators or other therapies. And this is the approach that people have taken. So some of the antivirals that have been in the news, obviously everybody's heard of remdesivir. It is one of the arms that is being tried in the WHO-run Solidarity trial. And Solidarity also has a combination antiviral, lopinavir, ritonavir, with and without interferon 1 beta in two of the other arms. And hydroxychloroquine is the fourth arm that is being used for Solidarity. Solidarity is a study that began about a little over a month ago. And the idea is to recruit large numbers of patients and capture key outcomes in them. One of the problems that we've encountered with the whole COVID-19 scenario and the enthusiasm and, hunger really to find a good treatment has been that lots and lots of different kinds of treatments have been tried. And the problem that we are encountering is that for many of the trials that were registered and started, they have been unable to recruit sufficient patients into their trials. So it makes sense to go for larger studies such as Solidarity, which are more likely to give you an answer than do many small trials where you will not come up with a definitive answer and will then need to continue on to other studies. One example of this is that from China, we've had reports of remdesivir not working, whereas the larger NIH study does show some results. And similarly, the first reports of lopinavir ritonavir did not show an effect. The jury is still out on that one, and we hope that we will get an answer from the Solidarity trial. There is a lot that we are learning, both in terms of drug development as well as in terms of treatment strategies. For example, early in the course of COVID-19, there was a feeling that we needed to get patients onto ventilators very quickly because that would provide them with better respiratory support. Whereas now we understand that the best thing for survival is to keep patients off ventilators for as long as possible and treat them with high flow oxygen through a nasal cannula. An additional approach that has been found to be useful is to turn patients onto their stomachs, something called pronation, which is usually used to ventilate other parts of the lung. This used to be done mostly for patients who were on ventilators, and it's been found that this is beneficial for patients who are on oxygen as well. So while we go after specific therapies like antivirals, host-directed therapies like immunomodulators, or even protection like plasma therapy, we should not forget that we also need to figure out what supportive therapy is going to be useful. And the oxygen and pronation is examples of learning more even in terms of supportive therapies.
So it's not just about the drugs and the vaccines, but the kind of clinical procedures and what we do once a patient is exhibiting severe symptoms and is hospitalized, right? And how we take care of them thereafter. So, Dr. Kang, a few follow-ups. One, are some of the studies, the human studies that are happening, are they happening with drugs that have already passed human safety tests of one form or the other? They've at least passed phase 1, if not phase 2 and 3. And is the idea that we are teaching those old drugs new tricks, or we are seeing which of these existing library of human safe medicines could possibly try and help us fight off this infection?
Absolutely. So there are a number of drugs that are already available that people are using in various kinds of trials. And I think the most famous one is probably hydroxychloroquine, which has actually never been shown to be an effective antiviral. It has good effects in cell culture models, but it has been tried for MERS and for other coronaviruses and hasn't really worked. We have licensed antiretrovirals as well as other licensed compounds that are being tried. One example is nitazoxanide. Nitazoxanide was an antiparasitic agent that has been shown to also have some antiviral effects. And there are a couple of ongoing trials that are looking at prevention of COVID-19 in high-risk populations, such as the elderly and healthcare workers. And another trial is being planned for treatment of COVID-19. Another anti-parasitic agent that is being tried is ivermectin, which was reported to have activity in a cell culture system in Australia a couple of months ago. And this is now being looked at in an observational study where they've looked at ivermectin use in patients who were hospitalized with confirmed COVID-19. Lopinavir, ritonavir, with and without interferon 1 beta is something that I've already mentioned, and there are both individual trials as well as the Solidarity study that are going on for that.
My second follow-up was on the Solidarity trial. So we are hearing some news about India also signing up for this, and in various rules being passed where they're encouraging individual hospitals to also sign up, right? So could you tell us a little bit about India and the trial so far?
Solidarity is managed by the WHO, and it is a very simple study in that when you decide that a particular facility is going to participate in the trial, you look at what are the interventions that are available in that facility. Currently, the trial has 4 arms, and those are remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, with and without interferon 1 beta. So, depending on if you have 3 of those products, then you say this hospital will be able to provide these 3 products. And WHO will give you an approach to randomization. So, when your patient comes in, if you have 3 or 4 treatments available, according to that, you will be given a code for the patient. And according to that code, that patient will get the therapy that is assigned by WHO. So it may be any of the 4 arms or any of 3 arms, depending on whether all 3 or all 4 of the drugs are available with you. In India, ICMR is coordinating the participation of hospitals into Solidarity, and we started recruiting patients at the end of April. The more hospitals that participate in this study, the more likely we are to get answers to whether these drugs are working or not. When a patient is signed up, a certain amount of clinical information has to be entered for that patient. But the outcomes that you are measuring for Solidarity are very simple. They are, did the patient get discharged or did the patient die? Discharged is seen as doing well on the trial. Death obviously is a lack of success with the intervention that was tried. The reason for designing this study as an uncomplicated clinical trial was really to get large numbers and to be able to do research in the context of a pandemic when doctors and hospitals that are going to put patients on these treatments are going to be really, really busy and are not going to have time for all the paperwork that usually goes along with a standard clinical trial. So Solidarity is intended to recruit about 10,000 patients, and last I heard, they were at over 6,000.
Wow. This was actually going to be my follow up on how challenging it can be to just administer a clinical trial, and how hospitals that might be overwhelmed right now may not have the spare bandwidth, if you will, to do a good job of the trial as well as the treatment and the management of patients.
So the database that has been set up for Solidarity is an electronic one, so no paper forms, no checking. So it will not be the kind of study that we treat as a usual clinical trial that has a lot of different forms and a lot of information. Here you've got information at the start and you've got information at the end. And what happens in between is not being documented, at least for WHO purposes. But one of the things that WHO has pointed out is that this should be considered as a mother trial. And there is the opportunity for hospitals and for countries that want to do more than Solidarity to gather much, much more information on their patients. And this is where the bandwidth question comes in. If you have bandwidth, you can collect a lot more information that will be very valuable. But if you don't, at least can we get this much information that will then inform treatments around the world.
Thanks, Dr. Kang. So going back, you mentioned that many of these antivirals will have to be used very early in the infection stage. Otherwise, they'll have to be used with some sort of immunomodulator drugs. So is that one way where we can imagine these antivirals to also act as prophylaxis? So if we feel like we have a fever coming on, or even if we are asymptomatic and at high risk, once these drugs are developed and once there is good science behind it, can we also expect them to be preventive in some way in the short term? Or do you need separate trials for that too?
I would not advise people to take an antiviral just as a preventive without real evidence. And the reason for doing that is that we need to understand that no drug is safe. So, absolutely nothing, not even aspirin, is a safe drug. When you know that in 80% of cases you are going to have an infection that you will be able to handle, that symptoms you will be asymptomatic or have mild or moderate symptoms, then I would advise people not to take a drug if you don't fit into a risk category. And if you do fit into a risk category, I would advise that we have proper clinical trials of that prophylaxis before we start to take it. You don't know for how long you're going to need a prophylaxis. You don't know what the cumulative doses of your drugs are going to be. You don't know how those drugs are going to affect you. Every time you take a drug, you have to do a risk benefit calculation. And if you don't know what the benefits are going to be, do you really want to take the risks?
Absolutely. And even amongst drugs, there are so few drugs for humans that are actually meant for chronic consumption or long-term consumption, right? Like, for example, if I can give a personal example, I have reflux problems for over a decade. So I take a proton pump inhibitor, right? I mean, Pantodac is a word that people might have heard. And this is one of the few drugs that can be taken safely for years on end. But even this has side effects like reducing my vitamin D absorption levels and B12 absorption levels and so on, right? So to take a more dangerous drug which has side effects when the benefits are unknown is extremely problematic.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So on this, I want to jump a little more. You mentioned remdesivir earlier. It's a part of the Solidarity trial. As you said, there was one sort of half study that came out of China and that wasn't very conclusive. We are still waiting on the full data from the NIH trial. Could you tell us about this drug and what's happening around it?
Sure. Remdesivir is a broad spectrum antiviral agent. It's a nucleotide analog prodrug. So it gets processed to become the drug. And it was studied, it was developed originally for Ebola, and it had very limited benefit in Ebola. And in cell culture models, when it was tried with SARS coronavirus and with MERS coronavirus, it seemed to inhibit replication of the viruses. So this was then moved into animal models and it showed efficacy in the animal models for SARS and MERS. So subsequent to that, when SARS-CoV-2 came around, several phase 3 clinical trials were started in China and South Korea, in the United States, and it's been given on a compassionate use basis in many places, including on the Diamond Princess cruise ship. So once the trials of remdesivir that we've seen, the one trial that was published from China, this showed that remdesivir was not associated with clinical benefit in terms of time to clinical improvement in adults who had been hospitalized with severe COVID-19. They did have a slightly faster time to improvement, but it didn't reach clinical significance. So essentially, the authors concluded that it needed to be tried in a larger population. The incomplete data that we have from the NIH study tells us that there is a reduction in the time to discharge among patients who have received remdesivir, but we really don't have a lot of information on other clinical parameters. Now, remdesivir is a drug that needs to be given intravenously, and it has to be given for 10 days as currently proposed, but there is an ongoing study that is looking at a 5-day regimen, which means that it's essentially double the number of doses of remdesivir that are available. So it seems like remdesivir does have some effect on shortening the duration of illness, but it is not a complete cure. It's not a wonder drug that is going to solve all of our problems. It does have some benefit, and it would be useful to see in which populations you get the greatest benefit, so that if you have a limited number of doses available, then the drug can be targeted towards them.
So this also means then that even if the new study checks out, it gives us favorable results, it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of how we are handling this pandemic and how we're responding, right? Because the infection rates will be the same. Maybe we can have some control over the hospital load and the mortality rates, but otherwise everything else will be happening as before.
Yes. And if you want to think about giving an antiviral early in the course of illness, obviously it cannot be an injectable like remdesivir.
Right. And trying to get it to an oral form is a completely different challenge, right? Which is not within the current scope of activities.
I'm sure there are people who are working on that, as well as working on seeing whether other antivirals will act.
Okay. So here I want to have a couple of follow-up. One, while we are developing antivirals, we've seen antiviral resistance be a very important issue in HIV. Do you see that to be a challenge going forward in COVID-19 as well?
It's certainly feasible because many antivirals are such that the viruses develop resistance to them, and RNA viruses can mutate at a faster rate than DNA viruses. Now, in terms of how long it would take to develop resistance, that is unpredictable. But one thing that is important to remember is that if there is a protein that has a key function, then that tends to be something that will not mutate easily. So the virus will have a tendency to conserve the gene sequences of the areas that serve essential functions. You could have a mutation in the sense of one nucleotide replacing another, as long as it didn't change what the protein looks like. And that can happen. What you need in order to develop resistance is to have a resistance that have a mutation that occurs that alters the function of that protein so that your antiviral is no longer targeting that function. So that can take a while to develop, does not always happen easily. And a way to approach that potentially is to do what we do for HIV and TB, which is see whether you can have a combination of drugs so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
So even if it develops resistance to one particular drug, it can still be taken out by the other. So Dr. Kang, my sort of final question to wrap up our conversation. Here we are seeing remdesivir coming out of Gilead, which is a private pharmaceutical in the US. We are seeing hydroxychloroquine, which is it's not under any patent regime right now, but you have a few big manufacturers in India. So you have various players across the world who will be involved in the production, in the research, in the development of all of these drugs going forward. So how do you see private, public, and nonprofit partnerships being shaped in this time? What do you holds out hope that if a drug is developed quickly, it can be deployed rapidly across the world and can be accessible to a large number of people?
WHO has just announced the ACT Accelerator, which is the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. And the idea there is access. How do you get diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines to the people who need them the most as quickly as possible? what are the public-private partnerships that can make this happen? And this is going to be a huge challenge because what we are seeing from some countries, the US, for example, is an increase in nationalism, saying, whatever tools there are for us first. And we are not going to be sharing them till we've addressed our own needs. You can understand that from a sovereign perspective, but I also think this is the time for us to be global good citizens. And one of the most encouraging things about the ACT Accelerator is that many of the major pharma companies have signed up to be part of that, to think about how they can use what they have to benefit all of society. Obviously, they haven't suddenly turned into saints, but I think when the need is as intense as it is just now, many people will do what Gilead has done, which is say that it's willing to give non exclusive licenses to many companies in many parts of the world to manufacture remdesivir. So I understand that there are multiple companies in India that are going to be making the drug here. So that's the way that I think a lot of companies will approach this. I think if we look back to the Ebola outbreak and the Ebola vaccine that was developed, the first licensed vaccine was made by Merck. And Merck is never going to make a profit on an Ebola vaccine because the places in which the disease occurs are places that can't afford to pay the real or whatever Merck would like for the price of a vectored vaccine to be. So although Merck took over the company that was making the vaccine, made the vaccine, this is not going to be a profitable venture for them. And I don't think that in the stage that COVID 19 is a pandemic, companies will be or should be looking to make a profit out of this. This is a time when all of us need to work together, whether that's society or government or what are usually commercial enterprises.
Thank you, Dr. Kang, for walking us through what it feels like to develop these drugs and test them before we start using them at scale. I also wanted to follow up on our previous conversation on vaccine development. Since our conversation, I think some of the early results from Moderna's mRNA vaccine have come out. And I think there's also a more news about calling for volunteers for, I think, a challenge trial that's also happening. So maybe could you give us a quick recap of the most important developments that you've seen over the past month for our listeners?
Sure. So in terms of vaccines overall, we've had many more vaccines come into clinical trials. There are 8 that are in or have been through phase 1. There are 2 that are going into phase 2. One in China has already started. And we had the results from immunogenicity for the Moderna phase 1 trial. Essentially, in that trial, Moderna was using its mRNA vaccine in a small number of volunteers to look at safety and at immunogenicity. In terms of safety, what we've seen is that of the 3 doses that were tried, there were no side effects. In the lowest dose, there was some redness. In the medium dose and at the high dose, there were some concerns about safety, but nothing severe, nothing serious. So in terms of safety, it's looking good. In terms of immunogenicity, they found that with the highest dose, you got a good immune response with just the first dose. And with the low dose, 25 micrograms, after 2 doses, you got a higher response than you see in naturally infected patients. So if you look at this, it looks promising. The vaccine is safe. It is generating an immune response. But whether that immune response will be protective or not, we don't know yet, because the assays for which have been used for immunogenicity are assays that measure binding. And what we'd like to see is a full set of data for all of the participants, giving us not just the binding assays, but also the neutralization assays. So to summarize, it's a safe vaccine, it's an immunogenic vaccine. We don't know yet whether it is a protective vaccine, and we will learn that in subsequent clinical trials. On the human challenge studies, so human challenge studies are something that has been around for a very long time. And in the early stages of human challenge, there were a lot of ethical issues because the people who were deliberately infected were not asked for consent. So, for example, if we go back through the history of vaccination, Jenner and the smallpox story is something that everybody knows, but that was really the first human challenge study that we know about, because Jenner vaccinated James Phipps, who was his gardener's son and was 8 years old. He gave him material from the lesion, cowpox lesion of a milkmaid, and then tried to induce smallpox and failed. So that was the first challenge study. But the fact that James Phipps' father was in a subordinate relationship to Jenner, to the fact that this was a child, these are things that would never be allowed by ethics committees today. So today, human challenge studies are done, very widely done, to inform both science and vaccine development, but they are done under very carefully controlled conditions. And the obtaining of informed consent from participants is a very long and continuous process so that people do completely understand the risks and benefits. Now, for COVID-19, this has been in discussion because you know that this disease is not a disease that severely affects young people. Many young people, in fact, don't even know they've had the infection. So the idea of human challenge is that if you have a vaccine candidate, can you give the vaccine candidate and then deliberately try to infect somebody? And if they get infected, then the vaccine doesn't work. And if they don't get infected, then the vaccine is working. This sounds good in principle. It's a great way if you have lots of different vaccines and you want to know quickly whether any of them are likely to work in the real world or not. This has been done for many vaccines before, including for a vaccine for typhoid that was made in India, but was tested in a challenge model in Oxford. So now people are thinking about it for COVID-19, and I understand that a lot of people have already started volunteering for such studies. WHO has published guidance on the ethical principles that need to be considered when doing such studies for COVID-19, and they revolve around ensuring the quality of the study to make sure that participants are as safe as possible, that there is justification for the study, and that there is complete informed consent and the best of care available for such participants. If these do go ahead, they may give us faster answers and accelerate the pathway to the development of vaccines.
They'd particularly be helpful in shortening perhaps the phase 3 of a lot of clinical trials, right?
You wouldn't want to replace the phase 3 because what you learn when you do a challenge study, you usually do it in less than a couple of hundred people. Whereas when you do an efficacy study in a population, you'd be looking for the same number of outcomes, few hundred people to get infected or not infected, depending on whether they got the vaccine or not. But you want a more generalizable population, so you tend to do phase 3 studies in thousands of people rather than in hundreds. So usually human challenge studies are considered phase 2B, and it is possible to license a vaccine just based on phase 2B studies. So, for example, there is a cholera vaccine called Vaxchora made in the US, and this was licensed on safety data from about 3,000 participants and efficacy data on 125 participants who took part in a human challenge study. So these processes do exist, and they might be a faster pathway to vaccines. But if you license a vaccine based on a human challenge study, then you would want to assess how the vaccine is performing in the community by doing a post-marketing surveillance that is more intense than the standard surveillance that is done. So instead of safety, you would want to look at both safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine post-licensure.
Okay. Thank you so much for putting that in context, because many of people are talking about it as a game changer again, but we need to understand it in the full context of vaccine development. Dr. Khan, thank you again for joining us on BIC Talks, demystifying the science and showing us how progress is happening step by step. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Next week on BIC Talks, Gagandeep Kang returns to the podcast to talk about the ongoing drug development efforts on COVID-19. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.